The host had barely started the program when that familiar tightness settled in my chest, the kind that always shows up whenever I'm seated between my father and Caleb in a room full of people who seem to know exactly where their lives are going. Earlier, a coordinator had passed out small ivory cards for us to write our occupation for the on-stage announcement. I held mine under the table, thumb tapping against the blank line. I wrote one title, erased it, tried another, erased again. Nothing felt safe. Nothing felt like something my family could hear without rolling their eyes. Eventually, I folded the card shut and tucked it beneath my plate. Caleb noticed immediately. He always did. "Still can't even settle on a job title," he murmured, leaning closer with that familiar half-smirk. "Seriously, Lana, you call that a career?" Dad didn't laugh out loud, but his amusement showed in the small shake of his shoulders. He leaned toward Mom, seated right beside me, and spoke as if I weren't inches away. Mom pressed her lips together, taking a slow sip of her water, avoiding eye contact. "How does she work without a company or a boss?" Dad whispered. "No office, no supervisor. It doesn't make sense." Their comments didn't slice the way they once did, but the weight of them still pressed down in that old predictable way. I kept my eyes fixed on the stage as servers cleared plates and refilled glasses, pretending the noise of the ballroom washed their voices out. Around us, families were excited, chatting, smiling, lifting glasses. Everyone seemed proud of someone. My family seemed entertained by doubting me. When the host picked up the next envelope, the room gradually fell quiet. My heartbeat wasn't pounding, just a little faster, like it always does when something unpredictable is about to unfold. "Our next finalist for Innovation in Data Solutions," he read, pausing as his eyes skimmed the card. I felt the shift beside me, both Dad and Caleb turning my way, waiting for something they were sure wouldn't come. Lana Reed. A faint ripple went through the ballroom, surprised curiosity, the sound of people trying to place a name with a face. I stood smoothing my dress and started toward the stage, keeping my steps steady and unhurried. The spotlight snapped onto me, warm and bright. But before I'd made it halfway, someone from the middle tables spoke aloud, unintentionally cutting through the quiet. "Wait, hold on. Isn't that her?" The giant screen behind the stage flickered. The host turned around, startled, as the event graphics vanished and a live news broadcast appeared. It was clearly unplanned. His expression alone confirmed that. A red banner scrolled across the bottom, "Breaking Data Architect Behind Market Stabilization Model Identified." Then footage filled the screen, grainy video of me from last week stepping out of a cafe with my laptop, a reporter following a few steps behind. I'd brushed past him because I was late, not because I was avoiding anything. Now the entire ballroom was staring at that clip like they were looking at a completely different person. Whispers rose immediately. "That's her. She works alone. She built that model by herself." The tone wasn't dismissed anymore. It was a curiosity, even awe. Dad leaned forward, eyes narrowing as if he needed a better angle to convince himself it really was me. Caleb's smirk collapsed entirely, leaving him staring at the screen with a confusion I had never seen on his face before. The host tried to recover. "Miss Reed, do you want to continue?" But his voice faded because the broadcast audio had overtaken the speakers. "Operating independently outside corporate affiliation. Sources confirm the architect declined all formal offers." Suddenly the whole room had gone still. Not silent, just suspended, like everyone was recalculating what they thought they knew. Every pair of eyes was on me. Not in judgment, not in pity, but in recognition. I stopped walking for a moment. Not dramatically, just enough to absorb the shift in the air. All the things my family had dismissed as make-believe or temporary or unserious were now displayed on a 30-foot screen in front of hundreds of people. Behind me, Caleb's voice reached my ears, low, shaken, stripped of the usual arrogance. "Lana, what did you do?" I didn't turn around. I didn't need to, because for the first time in my life, the truth wasn't something I had to defend or explain. It was right there, undeniable, in front of everyone, including the two people who had spent years minimizing everything I worked for. And as I stood under that spotlight halfway to the stage, I realized something simple and sharp. I wasn't the one who looked small tonight. Not anymore. For a moment, I couldn't tell whether the ballroom had gone quiet or if my mind had filtered every sound out on its own. The host was still on stage, frozen mid-gesture, his mouth parted as if he'd lost his next line. The news broadcast kept looping behind him, replaying that short clip of me stepping out of the cafe. Cameras flashed. Guests angled their phones toward the screen, then toward me, then back again, as if the three images didn't make sense together. I moved again slowly, because standing still made me feel like I was on display. My heels made soft taps against the carpeted aisle, almost swallowed by the hush that had settled over the room. I wasn't shaking, but there was a strange lightness spreading through my arms, like my body was trying to process everything faster than my mind could keep up. All I could think was, this wasn't supposed to happen tonight. Not here, not like this. Someone near the front whispered, "She turned down 4 companies last quarter." Another voice added, "Didn't she design the early version of that forecasting engine?" The murmurs built quick and overlapping, and for the first time since I'd arrived, none of them carried any mockery. They sounded intrigued, maybe even impressed. When I reached the bottom step of the stage, the host met me halfway, still flustered. He tried to speak, but one of the event producer's headset on expression tight, hurried over, tapped him on the arm, and leaned close. Whatever she said was meant to be discreet, but her tone gave her away. Urgent, concerned. The host nodded, straightened, and lifted the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, it appears we are experiencing a technical interruption. We'll resume the program shortly." Technical interruption. That was generous. The broadcast still ran behind him, ticker line flashing bold headlines about an independent architect linked to a model that had steadied last week's market chaos. My name hadn't been attached publicly until now. I turned slightly enough to see my family. Mom lowered her hand, her eyes wide, but behind the shock there was a flicker of undeniable fierce pride I hadn't seen before. Caleb looked pale, something between outrage and disbelief contorting his features. Dad wore a deeply furrowed expression as if he were trying to reconstruct every assumption he'd ever made about me and failing. He didn't look upset. He looked lost. It startled me more than anything else tonight. Before I could head toward the stage microphone, a staff member approached her badge, swinging as she hurried up. "Miss Reed, would you mind stepping backstage with me for a moment? The organizers, well, they'd like to speak with you privately." I followed her through a side door, listening to the muffled hum of the ballroom fade behind us. The hallway was cool and much quieter, a contrast that made my pulse sound louder in my own ears. She led me to a small green room where 2 event coordinators and a man in a navy suit waited. The man stepped forward first. "Ms. Reed, I'm Owen Hale, security liaison for the venue. We weren't expecting the broadcast to air tonight, and we want to make sure you're comfortable continuing with the program." His voice was calm, but practiced the kind you hear from people used to crisis control. "I'm fine," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. "Is the broadcast a problem?" "It's just unexpected," one of the coordinators chimed in. "Some guests seem surprised. We want to avoid any disruption." Surprised? That was one way to put it. Owen opened a tablet and turned it toward me. "The news outlets didn't name you earlier today. The leak must have happened within the last hour. They're framing you as a key figure behind last week's stabilization model." "Is that accurate?" I hesitated. "Accurate enough." He studied me for a long beat. "Then you should expect attention tonight. Cameras? Questions? Maybe more interesting than you're used to." I gave a short breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "You have no idea." A staffer knocked, then peeked in. "They're about to resume the ceremony. Should we send her back out?" All eyes shifted to me, waiting for an answer I hadn't prepared. The whole situation felt surreal, walking in, as the person my family never took seriously walking out, as the person the press was suddenly scrambling to identify. "I should finish what I came here for," I finally said. Owen nodded and motioned for someone to guide me back. The green room door closed, and the hallway felt even longer on the way out. My steps were steady again, though my chest carried a strange mix of adrenaline and clarity. By the time I returned to the wings of the stage, the host had regained his composure, and the audience had settled back into their seats, though the air still carried that electric buzz of curiosity. When my name was announced again, this time intentionally, the applause rose without hesitation. Real applause. Warm, focused, Not polite, not forced. I walked onto the stage, accepted the glass award from the host, and offered a short nod. The microphone waited for me, but before I spoke, my eyes drifted toward the back of the ballroom where my family sat. Dad looked at me as if he were trying to recognize a daughter he didn't quite know. Mom blinked rapidly, overwhelmed, but proud in a way I hadn't seen before. Caleb's jaw was tight, his expression unreadable defensiveness mixed with something else I'd never seen on him. Uncertainty. When I finally leaned toward the microphone, my voice came out steady. "Thank you." It was all I could get out without revealing the storm inside me, so I kept it simple. The audience seemed to understand something had shifted, even if they didn't know what to call it. After the ceremony ended, people approached executives, analysts, founders, each wanting to shake my hand or ask about the model or offer a connection. I answered politely, though my mind was already spinning ahead. What had leaked? How much did they know? Who had tipped off the networks? One woman handed me her card. "If you ever want to build something bigger, call me." Another said, "I've followed your Git boards for months. Didn't realize it was you." It was surreal hearing respect in their voices instead of doubt. Through the crowd, a figure approached with more confidence than the others, a man in a deep charcoal suit, tall, composed, carrying an air of quiet authority. The kind that wasn't loud, but unmistakably powerful. I hadn't seen him inside the ballroom earlier, yet he moved toward me like someone who belonged in every room he entered. "Ms. Reed," he said, offering his hand. His voice was calm, low, almost careful. "I've been trying to reach you for several weeks." I frowned, shaking his hand. "Have we met?" "Not formally," he said with a slight smile, "but my name is Ethan Vale." The name hit harder than the handshake. People in finance whispered about him, constantly venture tycoon strategic prodigy, the kind of investor who could build or break an entire sector with one decision. I had brushed off his emails, assuming they were from an intern exaggerating a job offer. Now he stood right in front of me. I think Ethan continued, still holding my attention with unsettling ease. "You and I should talk. Tonight, if you're willing." Everything in me went very still. Something told me the news broadcast wasn't the only surprise waiting for me. Something else, something bigger had just begun. The morning after the awards felt nothing like a victory. I woke up in the hotel room with my phone buzzing nonstop. Emails, missed calls, interview requests, calendar invites from people I'd never met. The sunlight slipped between the curtains in faint lines, and for a second I considered hiding under the covers until the notifications burned themselves out. That fantasy lasted about 3 seconds. I sat up, blinked at the screen, and scrolled through a string of messages labeled urgent follow-up and need to confirm identity. A headline from the night before filled my lock screen again. Unaffiliated architect identified as key figure in stabilization model. They still hadn't used the algorithm's full name, thank God, but the attention was already swelling like a wave rushing toward shore. A soft knock broke through the noise. Too light to be housekeeping, too hesitant to be management. I wrapped the robe around myself and opened the door a few inches. Mom stood there holding 2 paper cups of coffee and wearing the same expression she used whenever she wanted to check if I was upset, but didn't want to ask directly. "I thought you'd be awake," she said gently. "Mind if I come in?" I stepped aside, letting her enter. She perched on the edge of the armchair, handing me one of the coffees. "Your father didn't sleep much," she said, watching the steam rise from her cup. "Neither did Caleb." A ripple of irritation crossed my mind. "He didn't sleep because of me?" She shook her head. "He didn't sleep because he doesn't know where he fits now. He's never seen a room react to you that way." That wasn't what I expected her to say. Usually she wrapped her words in polite caution. This morning she sounded almost honest. "I'm fine, Mom," I said softly. "I know." Her eyes warmed. "I think that's what scares them." Before I could respond, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a name I recognized, Adrian Cole, the founder who owned half the headlines in the tech world, the man who had sent polite inquiries months ago that I ignored because I wasn't ready to take anyone's money. Mom leaned forward. "Are you going to answer it?" "I don't know," I admitted. She stood, smoothing her jacket. "You don't owe anyone anything, not even us. But maybe don't ignore the whole world today." When she left, the room grew quiet again, except for the hum of the air conditioner and my buzzing phone. I finally swiped to open the voicemail. Lana, this is Adrian. I'm sure your night was overwhelming. I'd like 10 minutes, just a conversation, nothing binding. I'm at the cafe across the street. Whenever you're ready. He had left the message 28 minutes earlier. I dressed quickly, pulled my hair into a loose knot, and grabbed my jacket. Downstairs, the lobby was unusually busy. A couple of people glanced at me, then at their phones, whispering in a way that made me want to keep walking without slowing down. I stepped outside into the cool air, crossed the street, and pushed open the cafe door. Adrian sat near the window phone, face down, hands clasped loosely in front of him. He looked up the second I entered, offering a calm nod rather than an eager wave. I appreciated that more than he probably knew. I slid into the seat across from him. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't." I figured he said, a hint of a smile forming. "But last night changed a few things, didn't it?" I didn't respond. He could see the answer on my face. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thin folder. "I'm guessing your inbox looks like a slot machine right now. Reporters, analysts, recruiters, everyone wants something from you. Before that noise gets too loud, I wanted to show you something in private." He slid the folder across the table. Inside were screenshots, timestamps, and a familiar structure of metadata I instantly recognized. My pulse quickened. "These are traces from the leak," Adrian said. "Not the public ones. My team pulled this from a back channel hours ago. Someone accessed an early version of your model last week." My stomach tightened, from where his look grew serious. "Your old firm, Harlow and Knox." I swallowed hard. "Are you sure we double-checked?" Access came through an outdated credential that was never deactivated properly. He sat back, letting the weight of the information settle. "You didn't lose control of your work. Someone walked through a door that should have been locked years ago." A cold, familiar frustration spread through me. That company had always underestimated me, dismissed me even, but I never expected them to keep a key to my work. "That's not the worst part," Adrian continued. He turned the next page. "The person who used your old credentials sent fragments of your code outside the country." I lifted my eyes to him. "Who, we don't know yet," he admitted. "But it wasn't random, and the timing lines up a little too perfectly with last night's broadcast." My thoughts spiraled, racing through every possibility. I'd left Harlow and Knox on tense terms. Someone there would have seen the broadcast too. Someone might have wanted the world to know my name for reasons that weren't flattering. Adrian watched me quietly, letting me process. "You're not alone in this," he said after a moment. "Whether you work with me or not, you deserve to know what's happening behind your back." I exhaled slowly. "Why help me? You don't even know me." His expression softened. "Because what you built is important, and because the people coming after you aren't playing small." Before I could ask what that meant, the cafe door opened with a sharp hiss. Caleb walked in, scanning the room with an expression tighter than I'd ever seen on him. When he spotted us, he marched straight toward the table. "Lana," he said, voice sharper than necessary. "Why didn't you answer your phone? Dad's freaking out." His eyes cut to Adrian. "And who exactly are you?" Adrian extended his hand politely. "Adrian Cole." Caleb blinked, stunned. He didn't take the hand. "You're him." Adrian nodded once. "I am." My brother turned back to me, his expression shifting from annoyance to something unsettled. "What's going on? Why are you meeting with him?" There were a dozen ways to respond, but only one came naturally. "Because," I said calmly, "I'm not the person you thought I was." His jaw clenched. "So explain it." "I will," I said, "but not here, and not to you first." Caleb opened his mouth to argue, but the look in my eyes must have stopped him. For the first time in years, I didn't feel smaller in his shadow. He stepped back slightly, unsure of his place. Adrian watched the exchange silently, then leaned in. "You have choices to make, Lana. Big ones. And not everyone in your life is prepared for who you're becoming." When Caleb finally walked out of the cafe, I felt a strange, quiet clarity settle in. Something had shifted last night, more than the broadcast, more than the attention, more than the award. People who once dismissed me were now feeling the ground move beneath their feet. And I wasn't apologizing for it, not anymore. I didn't go straight home after leaving the cafe. My mind wouldn't settle enough for that. Instead, I walked the long way around the block, letting the cold morning air quiet the constant rush of thoughts. Cars moved in steady lines along the avenue, their noise blending into the background, while the conference center loomed a few streets behind me. I kept replaying Adrian's words the way he'd looked at me with an almost measured certainty. Someone had used my old credentials. Someone had moved pieces behind my back. And now the world was reacting faster than I could keep up with. When my phone vibrated again, I expected another reporter or recruiter. Instead, it was a single-line text from an unknown number. "You're being watched. Be careful who you trust." I stopped walking. The sidewalk felt suddenly narrower, the air a little colder. For a moment, I considered brushing it off as a prank, but something about the timing made my skin prickle. I slipped the phone into my coat pocket and continued down the street, keeping my pace even. No sudden turns, no signs of panic. A few cars passed. A bike messenger zipped by. Nothing looked unusual, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that attention had settled somewhere behind me. Across the street, a black sedan idled by the curb. Ordinary enough, except the driver didn't move. He didn't lean forward. He didn't check his phone. He just sat there staring out at the street in a way that felt too still. I quickened my pace slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to put space between us. When I rounded the next corner, I didn't hear the engine start yet. When I glanced back, the car had pulled forward a few yards. Slowly. Casually. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Paranoia was convenient but not reliable. Still, something in my stomach tightened a warning I'd never learned to ignore. I walked through a small plaza, letting the crowd thicken around me. People on their way to brunch, families pushing strollers, tourists taking pictures of the fountain. Their presence eased me just enough to breathe again. My phone buzzed a second time, eyes up. "Someone pinged your IP this morning." This time my pulse kicked up. Only a handful of people knew enough about me to send a message like that. Harlow and Knox definitely wasn't one of them. I opened the text thread, but the number vanished into a long string of masked digits. It wasn't Adrian. It wasn't anyone I recognized. Before I could respond, a third message came through. "Check your steps. You're not imagining the car." A chill slid through me. I turned toward the fountain to avoid revealing the expression on my face and scanned the edges of the plaza with a casual glance. The sedan had stopped along the opposite curb, the driver partially obscured by passing pedestrians. The windows were tinted, but not enough to hide the silhouette of a man leaning just slightly forward, watching. I headed toward the subway entrance at the far end of the plaza, moving at a pace that wouldn't draw interest. The car didn't follow. It couldn't not without circling around. That gave me time. I descended the stairs quickly and slipped through the turnstile just as the next train rumbled into the station. Inside the car, I found a seat near the window and watched the platform blur as we pulled away. Only when the train dove into the tunnel did my lungs finally relax. 2 stops later, I got off and climbed back to the street level on the opposite end of downtown. The air felt different here, busier, louder, less focused on me. I took a moment to steady myself before calling Adrian. He answered before the first ring finished. "Lana." "Someone's following me," I said quietly. "I think someone's tracking my activity too." There was no hesitation. "Where are you?" "Off Walnut and 9th. I took the subway to lose the car." "I'm sending a driver," he replied. "Stay where you are. Don't walk around. Don't go into any empty spaces. Adrian, Lana, please." His voice softened. "Just let me help you for 1 hour." Reluctance tugged at me, but the knot in my stomach refused to unwind. I stayed near the corner, surrounded by people avoiding reflective surfaces that might show my expression. The driver arrived within minutes, a clean silver SUV with a simple corporate logo on the side. Not flashy, not suspicious, just ordinary enough to blend in. When I climbed inside, the driver didn't speak. He simply nodded and pulled away from the curb. The ride was quiet, the kind that gives you time to notice things you usually ignore, the subtle weight of someone else trying to protect you. The eerie feeling of being important enough to track the strange realization that the life you thought was small might be much bigger than you imagined. We reached Adrian's office building in under 10 minutes. It wasn't the skyscraper I expected, but a restored brick warehouse with tall windows and a minimalist logo. Inside, the floors gleamed, the air smelled faintly of cedar, and everything moved with a deliberate, effortless rhythm. People glanced at me but didn't stare. Whatever Adrian had told them, they knew to keep their distance. He met me at the elevator, his expression tighter than it had been at the cafe. Tell me everything he said as he guided me into a conference room. The moment I finished recounting the texts and the car, he pulled up a system window on a wall-mounted screen. Dozens of lines of activity scrolled past IP pings, access attempts, flagged signals. "Someone probed your network twice this morning," he said, pointing at a highlighted line. "It wasn't random. They were searching for a route into your files." I felt my breath catch. "Can you trace it?" "Not alone," he said. "But my team can, and so can someone else who owes me a favor." "Who?" "You'll meet him later," Adrian replied. "For now, you need to stop using unsecured networks and stop going anywhere alone." The instructions sat heavy in the room. I didn't want to accept any of it, but pretending I wasn't in danger felt foolish now. Adrian leaned forward. "Lana, someone wasn't just curious about your model. They were desperate to find it. And whoever pushed last night's broadcast didn't do it because they wanted to celebrate you." My throat tightened. "Then why to flush you out?" he said quietly. The words hung between us, sharp and uncomfortably true. I didn't know who had done it, but someone out there wanted to pull me into the open. And now that they had succeeded, I could feel the shift. The game had started. The elevator doors closed behind us with a muted thud, sealing me inside with Adrian and the quiet tension neither of us wanted to name yet. His office was 2 floors up, but the ride felt longer, stretched thin by the weight of everything we weren't saying. When the doors opened again, he motioned for me to follow him down a narrow hallway toward a room I hadn't noticed earlier. A frosted glass panel beside the door read, "Operations," but the space inside looked nothing like a typical operations center, rows of screens, a soft hum of servers, team members leaning over consoles with the kind of intensity you only see in emergency rooms or military coordination hubs. As we stepped inside, a few people glanced our way, not startled, just aware. Adrian introduced me to a woman with sharp eyes and a calm posture. "This is Mira. She oversees data forensics." She shook my hand firmly, then walked us to a large screen displaying a series of access logs. "I isolated the traces from this morning," Mira said, using a stylus to highlight a cluster of timestamps. 3 attempts from an international proxy, 1 direct attempt from a location tied to Harlow and Knox. But that's not the part you need to worry about. She tapped the final entry. "Someone pulled your blueprint metadata from a channel outside both networks. Something personal." A prickling sensation crawled up my spine. "Personal how?" She zoomed in, isolating a string of encrypted characters. "Your home network ID, the one registered to your apartment lease." My stomach tightened. "I've never shared access with anyone." "That's why this worries us," Mira replied. "They didn't break into your network, they mimicked it. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were copying and who it would point to." The realization sank in slowly like cold water filling my lungs. Someone had replicated a piece of my digital identity. That wasn't an amateur move. That wasn't a random probe. It was deliberate. Adrian watched me carefully, arms crossed loosely, not in judgment, but in something closer to concern. "We need to find out who wants to control the narrative around your work," he said, "and who benefits from making you look careless." I exhaled, steadying myself. "Do you think it's someone from Harlow and Knox?" "It's possible," Adrian said, "but the access wasn't clumsy. Someone inside that firm would have had easier routes. This feels like someone who wants the trail to stop at them, but not because they belong there." The implication lodged itself inside my thoughts like a stubborn splinter. Someone wanted me implicated, but only enough to distract, not enough to fully frame me, not yet. Mira returned to the datasheet. "We also ran your name through the usual alerts. It triggered a file." She turned the screen toward Adrian. "Federal inquiries. This morning. A wave of pressure hit my chest. Federal. They're already looking at me. Slow down, Mira said gently. It's a routine flag, not a case. But it means someone submitted something with your work attached. Enough to get their attention. Adrian looked at me with a calm that didn't match the tension in the room. This is exactly why I reached out weeks ago. You're playing in a space where people don't always play fair. The screen went dark, leaving a soft reflection of my face staring back at me, tired, unsure, trying to process the scale of what I'd stepped into. Adrian walked me out of the operations room, guiding me back toward the hallway. Let's take a break, he suggested. My office is quieter. Inside his office, the noise faded. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, casting long patches of sunlight across the room. I sat on a low sofa while Adrian poured 2 glasses of water. When he handed one to me, I noticed a tiny tremor in my fingers. Not fear exactly, but a kind of anticipation mixed with uncertainty. You knew this could happen, I said softly. I knew someone would come after your work eventually, he replied. But last night moved the timeline forward, because someone leaked the footage, because someone wanted your name tied to the project before you could control the story. I let the words roll around in my head. My family saw it. My brother saw it. He still thinks I'm making things up half the time. Adrian tilted his head, studying me with quiet sincerity. Families adjust slowly to the people they think they understand, but they can't deny what happened last night. I wasn't sure if that made me feel better or worse. Caleb showed up at the cafe after you left. He looked scared. For you? No, I said, shaking my head. For himself. Adrian didn't look surprised. When someone around you changes, the people closest to you get nervous. They don't know their role anymore. His words hit a truth I hadn't been ready to name. Before he could say more, a knock sounded at the door. One of his assistants stepped in, tablet in hand. Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Cole, you need to see this. Adrian took the tablet, scanning the contents. A subtle shift crossed his face. He handed the screen to me. A headline glowed at the top of a government bulletin, request for voluntary discussion. Lana Reed. My mouth went dry. Voluntary. For now, Adrian said, it means someone filed something that caught their attention, probably flagged from last night's broadcast. The assistant cleared her throat. It was submitted anonymously. My pulse thudded hard against my ribs. Someone's trying to pull me in. Or rattle you, Adrian said. Either way, you need to stay ahead of it. I set the tablet down, feeling a strange steadiness settle through me. Then I need to know who sent it, and why. Adrian leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. We'll get there, but there's something you need to see before you decide your next move. He opened a drawer, pulled out a thin white envelope, and handed it to me. My name, typed cleanly in bold letters, sat in the center. No return address, no markings. It arrived this morning, Adrian said quietly. Addressed to you. A chill ran through me as I opened the flap. Inside was a single sheet of paper, nothing else. The message was typed in a narrow, sharp font. You're in the way. Step back. No signature, no threat of harm, no explanation. My hands felt stiff, but I took the envelope. The paper was heavy, cold, and strangely formal, like a notice from a court, not a threat. The meaning was unmistakable. Someone didn't want me digging deeper. Someone wanted control. Someone believed I could ruin their plan. And for the first time since the award ceremony, I felt something stronger than fear. I felt resolve. The envelope sat between us on Adrian's desk like a tiny bomb that hadn't finished ticking yet. I kept staring at the message, those 4 blunt words that didn't bother pretending to be subtle. Adrian watched me closely, probably waiting for the shock to sink in, but something else surfaced instead, irritation. Whoever sent this thought fear would make me fold. Fear wasn't new to me. Patronizing threats were. I folded the paper back into the envelope and slid it toward him. Someone really expects me to step aside just because they typed a sentence. People don't send warnings like that unless something bigger's at stake, he replied. It means you're closer to something than they want you to be. That's the problem, I said. I don't even know what I'm close to. He leaned back slightly, one hand on the arm of his chair. Maybe not directly, but someone thinks your work intersects with theirs, dangerously so. The implication unsettled me. My algorithms weren't built for sabotage or manipulation. They were about pattern resilience and adaptive structures. If someone wanted that for the wrong purpose... I didn't finish the sentence. Neither did Adrian. We both understood what it meant. He stood and motioned for me to follow him out of the office. "There's someone you need to meet." I grabbed my bag and walked beside him down the corridor toward a different wing of the building, one I hadn't entered yet. A discreet badge scanner guarded the door and a soft beep announced our access. The temperature dipped slightly and the faint hum of high-powered servers filled the air. Inside, a man with graying hair and wire-frame glasses hunched over a workstation. He didn't notice us until Adrian cleared his throat. The man turned, pushing his glasses up his nose with a small sigh of impatience. "Lana, this is Elias," Adrian said. "He's our institutional memory, for lack of a better description." Elias gave a short nod. "You're the one with the adaptive lattice model." "That's me," I replied. He gestured toward a large wall display. "Then you should understand this." Lines of data scrolled across the screen: logs, timestamps, code fragments, and something else. A cluster of anomalies pulsed in red among the streams of white. "That central cluster," Elias said, tapping the display, "has been appearing in our system for months. Sporadic, localized, easy to miss. But last night it aligned with an external breach attempt for the first time." "And it matched my file," I said quietly. "Not matched," Elias corrected. "Overlaid. Someone is layering your signature patterns onto their own activity, enough to blur the trail without fully impersonating you." The room felt colder. "Why me? I'm not a competitor. I'm barely a blip compared to the firms on your radar." "That's exactly why," Elias replied. "You're not under surveillance. You're not predictable. You're independent." Adrian stepped closer. "And your work is powerful. More than most people realize." The words landed with an uncomfortable weight. I had always treated my algorithms like tools, complex tools, sure, but still mine. Controlled, contained. But this wasn't containment. This was leverage. Something or someone was using the shape of my ideas to hide in plain sight. Elias pulled up an expanded file. "There's more. This anomaly isn't new. It traces back to an early-stage firm that shut down 2 years ago. They had a small team experimenting with adaptive models, but the company collapsed. The founder disappeared, and now their digital fingerprints are resurfacing attached to your signature. The puzzle pieces felt forced, unnatural. Why would someone from a dissolved firm use my lattice structures? They didn't exist back then. Not publicly," Elias said, "but some of the underlying principles were part of your graduate research. Someone accessed your archival work." I felt the air thicken around me. "My old university servers, or someone who had access to them," he said. "Old memories flickered late nights in the computer labs, shared terminals, collaborative projects, names of people I hadn't thought about in years. One stood out like a bruise: Damien Cross. Brilliant, competitive, always hovering near my research but never directly collaborating. He'd vanished after graduation, supposedly leaving the field. But maybe he hadn't disappeared. Maybe he'd just gone dark." Adrian watched my expression shift. "You thought of someone." "Possibly," I admitted. "Someone who always wanted access to my early models. He asked for them before I had even finished my thesis." Elias looked almost satisfied. "Name, Damien Cross." Elias turned back to the screen and began typing rapidly. Within moments, profile entries appeared. Old conference attendance logs, outdated LinkedIn snippets, a handful of research citations. "Nothing recent, nothing useful. Either he went completely underground," Elias said, "or someone is using his shadow to mask themselves." A tightness pulled at my ribs. I need to talk to him, or find someone who can. Adrian's expression hardened. "Not alone. If this person knows how to exploit your work, they won't hesitate to exploit you." "I'm not fragile," I said. "I know," he replied. "That's why they're escalating." My phone vibrated before I could respond. A new text message appeared: unknown number. My thumb froze above the screen when I read the words, "You're looking in the wrong direction. Check your own family." Blood roared in my ears. Adrian stepped closer. "What is it?" I showed him the message. His jaw tightened. That's not random." "No," I whispered. "It isn't." He signaled Elias. "Trace this number. Now." Elias was already typing. I stared at the words again, trying to make sense of them. "Check your own family." I didn't want to believe it. Caleb was infuriating, dismissive, and sometimes cruel, but he wasn't criminal. My dad, even less likely. But doubt spreads quickly, faster than logic. Adrian's voice cut through my thoughts. "Lana, whoever sent that text wants you destabilized. Don't assume it's true." I nodded, but the unease wouldn't loosen its grip. "If they want me rattled," I said quietly, "it's working." Adrian's expression softened. "Then we steady you before you take another step." Before either of us could say more, Elias swiveled his chair toward us. "You're not going to like this," he said, tapping the screen. "The number is masked through a residential router. I registered 2 days ago." "Where?" I asked. Elias clicked, pulling up the address. My breath stalled. It was my parents' street, their neighborhood, their provider, but not their exact house. The router was registered 4 doors down. Someone close enough to watch, close enough to mimic, close enough to know when I'd visit. The chill running through me this time wasn't uncertainty. It was the unmistakable realization that whoever I was dealing with didn't just know my work. They knew my life, they knew my family, and they were getting closer. The address on Elias's screen stayed with me long after we left the office, replaying in my thoughts as Adrian guided the car toward my old neighborhood. Familiar streets blurred past us, places I used to bike through, houses that once felt safe and unremarkable. None of them looked like part of a threat. If anything, the quiet suburb felt frozen in time, as if nothing dangerous could possibly grow between its trimmed hedges and porch lights. Adrian parked a block away from my parents' house. "Less attention," he said, stepping out with the kind of calm that made me feel steadier than I actually was. I followed him down the sidewalk, my heart beating faster with every step closer to the beige rental 4 doors from where I grew up. The house looked ordinary in every possible way. Beige siding, cheap shutters, a mailbox that leaned as if no one bothered fixing it. I'd walked past it hundreds of times when I lived here, never once stopped to think about who lived inside. "Someone's been using a router from this address to mask their location," Adrian murmured. "It could be anyone. These rentals turn over all the time," I whispered back. A slight flicker cut through the window, a curtain shifting. Not an accident. Someone inside had seen us. "Keep walking," Adrian said quietly. My legs felt stiff, but I forced myself to move, as though we were just 2 people enjoying a calm evening stroll. Nothing in the street changed. No lights flickered on, no doors opened. But the sense of eyes following us tightened something deep in my chest. When we reached the end of the block, Adrian finally exhaled. "Whoever's there knows us now." "I know," I said. They watched from less than 30 feet away. Before he could respond, footsteps approached from behind us. "Lana!" My dad's voice cut through the tension. He held a grocery bag in one arm, still wearing his work shirt. His gaze moved between the 2 of us, confused but not suspicious yet. "What are you doing around here? I didn't think you were visiting today." I hesitated. Adrian stepped forward smoothly, extending a hand. "Evening, sir. We're just taking a walk." Dad shook his hand, though his attention kept pulling back to me. "Did Caleb call you?" My stomach tightened. "No." "Why?" "He stopped by earlier. Seemed jumpy. Asked whether you'd mentioned anything." "Strange lately." Dad frowned. He wouldn't tell me what he meant. Adrian and I traded a quick glance. "Did he say where he was going?" I asked. "He didn't stay long. Drove off fast." Dad's tone dipped softer now. "Everything okay?" I forced a small nod. "Yeah. Just work things." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't pry either. "Well, your mom's been talking non-stop about that award ceremony," he said. "Come home for dinner tomorrow." The memory hit me hard, the laughter, the whispers, the look on Caleb's face when the host read my name. That night felt like another lifetime, a different version of me. "We'll see," I said gently. Dad waved and headed home. Watching him disappear into the house made something twist inside me, fear and guilt mixing in ways I didn't want to unpack yet. Adrian waited until my dad was gone before speaking. "Your brother's involved in something. Or someone wants us to think he is. Maybe both. The drive back to the city felt longer than it should have. Rain slid across the windshield in thin streaks, blurring the neon signs outside. Adrian's phone buzzed halfway back and he checked the screen. It's Elias. He tapped an audio message. Elias's voice filled the car. Preliminary results on the rental house. The leaseholder name is fake. Payments routed through shell accounts. Power usage is abnormally high enough to run multiple servers. Whoever's there is operating something significant. Adrian lowered the phone. They're not just hiding. They're building something. And using my structures to cover it, I said. The rain intensified, and city lights refracted through the drops like fractured glass. I stared out the window, trying to quiet the rising pressure inside me. We need to talk to Caleb, I said. Adrian didn't argue. Tonight. I almost backed out. Caleb didn't handle stress well, and confronting him directly might push him into a corner, but avoiding him wasn't an option with anonymous warnings, data trails pointing at my childhood street, and a rental house lit up like a miniature server farm. We stopped at a small cafe near my building. Only a couple tables were occupied. Adrian ordered 2 coffees while I slid into a booth, rubbing my hands together to chase off the cold. My phone buzzed before he came back. A new message. Unknown number. I opened it, and my breath caught. It wasn't another warning full of vague phrases or threats pretending to be clever. Different this time. The screen showed a single photo. Caleb, standing right in front of the beige rental house. My thumb stayed frozen against the screen. A second message arrived instantly. He's asking the wrong questions. You're running out of time. Adrian set the coffees down and saw my face change. What happened? I turned the phone toward him. His jaw tightened as he took it in. Whoever's behind this is watching every move he said. And they're close. I swallowed hard, my voice barely steady. We need to find Caleb. Now. The lights in the cafe felt too warm, too bright, like the world around me hadn't realized it should be shaking apart. And for the first time, I understood just how dangerous this had become. What frightened me wasn't the code. It wasn't a breach in the system either. And whatever operation was happening just a few houses away from where I grew up, somehow that felt secondary compared to everything else. This was personal now, and they weren't hiding that anymore. Caleb didn't answer the first call, or the second. By the third, I stopped expecting him to pick up at all. Each ring felt like it echoed through my chest more than the phone itself, and by the time the line went to voicemail again, my frustration had settled into a tight, cold knot beneath my ribs. Adrian watched me from across the small table, his expression steady but sharpened with concern. He saw something he shouldn't have, I said quietly, or someone told him something. Either way, Adrian replied, he's avoiding you for a reason. I slid my phone into my jacket pocket, the photo still burning into my mind. Caleb standing in front of the rental house, unaware someone was close enough to capture him from less than 20 feet away. I replayed the angle, the lighting, the distance. Whoever took it hadn't been hiding in a car or behind a window. They were right there, moving freely, watching both of us. We need to find him, I said. Adrian didn't hesitate. Let's start with the obvious, his apartment. The drive across town took 20 minutes. Traffic slowed near a construction site, the streets already slick from the early drizzle. I barely noticed the scenery passing outside the windows. My thoughts were tangled in every possible reason Caleb might be involved or caught in something so far outside his depth. He wasn't a strategist, he wasn't subtle, and he definitely wasn't the type to go digging into things he didn't understand, but he was curious in all the wrong ways. That has always been the problem. When we reached his building, the parking lot was half empty, no sign of Caleb's car. Adrian parked and we headed for the entrance. The elevator hummed quietly as it rose, carrying us to the 4th floor where Caleb rented a corner unit. The hallway smelled faintly of detergent and stale pizza, comfortingly ordinary, which only made the moment feel more unsettling. I knocked once, waited, knocked again. Nothing. Adrian tilted his head. Let's try the office. Someone might have seen him today. The leasing office sat near the front of the complex. A young woman in a burgundy polo greeted us with a practiced smile. She recognized Caleb's name immediately and pulled up the resident log. He left this morning, she said. Didn't say much, just looked stressed. She frowned. Is he okay? Trying to make sure he is, I said. She hesitated, then added, he asked if our security cameras faced the street. I told him no. He didn't look happy about that. The knot in my stomach pulled tighter. Did he mention where he was going? Only that he needed to check something for his family. She paused. Sorry I can't be of more help. Outside, the rain picked up again, drumming softly against the hood of Adrian's coat. I stared at the wet pavement, thoughts spinning. Caleb looking for street cameras didn't match his usual behavior. He wasn't paranoid. He wasn't the type to mistrust his surroundings. Something scared him. Let's ask someone who actually knows his routine, Adrian said. I sighed. Mom. She answered on the second ring. Her voice carried a mixture of relief and worry. Lana, honey, is everything all right? Have you heard from Caleb today? I asked. There was a pause, barely 1 second, but enough to reveal she had. He came by earlier, she said slowly. He asked if you'd mentioned anything unusual. Then he asked if he'd gotten any mail addressed to you. He wouldn't explain. Mail addressed to me. At my parents' house. My pulse quickened. What did you tell him? That we hadn't gotten anything. He didn't look convinced. Adrian nodded slightly beside me, absorbing every detail. Mom's voice dropped. Is he in trouble? I don't know yet, I said, honestly. But if he reaches out again, tell him to call me. I will, she promised. Just be careful. When I hung up, Adrian rested one hand on the roof of the car, considering everything. He's searching for answers. Maybe trying to figure out why someone's watching your family, or why you're suddenly in the news. He picked the worst possible moment to start caring, I muttered. We don't know what he knows, Adrian said, but somebody sent him to that rental house, and whoever took that photo wanted you to see him there. Rain rolled down the windshield as we slid back into the car. Adrian started the engine but didn't put the car in gear. Before we chase him across the city, he said we need more context. Let's check your parents' street again. No approaching the rental house, just observation. Returning there felt like walking backward through a memory I didn't want to revisit. The street looked the same as before, still quiet, almost peaceful. Lights glowed softly behind drawn curtains. Someone across the way was bringing in their trash bin. 2 houses down, a dog barked at nothing, but the beige rental house sat completely dark now. No flicker behind the curtains, no silhouette shifting in the window. The stillness around it felt staged. Adrian scanned the area from inside the parked car. They know we came earlier. Someone reset their movements. I watched the house replaying the photo of Caleb again. The angle suddenly stood out. The shot came from behind a car parked across the street. The same car was there now, a gray sedan with fogged windows. Adrian, I whispered, do you see that? He followed my gaze. Same model, same placement, and the timestamp on the photo, 10 minutes after we left. His posture stiffened. Get down. I slid lower in my seat as he observed, quietly assessing. The parked sedan didn't move, but a faint glow lit the driver's side window for half a second, as if someone inside had checked a phone. They're still watching, Adrian murmured. Not just the house, the street, your family. A chill rippled through me. They wanted me to see Caleb near the house, and now they're showing me they're close to him. Close to all of us. Which means, Adrian said, eyes locked on the sedan, they're preparing for a next step. My voice dropped. And whatever that is, we're running out of room to stay ahead. He didn't disagree. The sedan's engine revved softly, barely audible. Then the headlights flicked on. A moment later, it pulled away from the curb with a slow, deliberate crawl, like whoever was inside wanted us to know they were leaving because they chose to not, because they felt threatened. Adrian didn't move until the car disappeared around the corner. We need to get ahead of this, he said, before they turn their attention from watching to acting. The weight of that truth settled over me like a cold, heavy blanket. Caleb wasn't answering his phone. Someone was tracking my family's movements, and the person behind the curtain in the rental house wasn't just a watcher anymore. They were circling, and time was starting to slip. Caleb's silence stretched into the next morning, turning every hour into a knot of unanswered questions. I barely slept replaying the photo again and again, studying the angle, the shadows, the posture of his shoulders. He hadn't looked scared in the picture, he'd looked confused, as if he'd stumbled onto something he didn't recognize, as if he'd gone there searching for clarity and found the opposite. By sunrise, Adrian and I were back at his office, both of us running on caffeine and worry. The building was quiet at this hour, the kind of quiet that amplifies every footstep on the tile floor. Elias joined us in the conference room, carrying a laptop under his arm. His tired eyes confirmed he hadn't slept either. I ran another trace on the number that sent that photo Elias said opening the laptop. Whoever masked it knew what they were doing. But they slipped once. Adrian leaned forward. How? A temporary ping through a residential network, Elias replied. 2 minutes before the photo was sent. It didn't originate from the rental house. My pulse picked up. Where then Elias turned the screen toward us. An address appeared familiar in a way that made my chest tighten. Caleb's apartment. No, I whispered. Someone spoofed his network. Maybe Elias said. But there was a device present we can't account for. Something connected to his Wi-Fi for less than 60 seconds. Adrian's expression darkened. So someone was in his apartment, or close enough to access his signal, Elias said. Either scenario isn't comforting. The room felt colder. Caleb had been near the rental house. Someone had been near his. The timing wasn't a coincidence, it was choreography. I need to see his place again, I said. Adrian nodded immediately. We go now. Traffic was light, the early morning sky washed in pale blue streaks. I watched the city pass by, without focusing on any one thing, my thoughts circling the same fear. Caleb didn't know how to protect himself. He assumed the world was straightforward, predictable, safe. He wasn't built for whatever game he'd stepped into, but he was curious in all the wrong ways. That had always been the problem. When we reached his building, the parking lot looked exactly the same as the night before, except this time, Caleb's car was there. Relief surged through me so fast it almost hurt. He's home, I said, already heading toward the stairs. Adrian followed close behind, scanning the surroundings with the kind of awareness I didn't have. Nothing looked off, no strange cars, no open windows, but the quiet held a tension that didn't belong in an apartment complex on a normal weekday morning. I knocked on Caleb's door. It's me, I said. Open up. Silence. I tried again, louder. Still nothing. Adrian stepped back, studying the doorframe. No signs of forced entry. He's inside, I said. His car's here. Or someone wanted us to think that. I shook the thought off. Caleb was messy, impulsive, emotional, not strategic enough to fake disappearance. I reached for the spare key he'd once given me in a moment of rare generosity. My hands trembled slightly as I slid it into the lock. The door opened without resistance. Caleb. My voice echoed faintly. His apartment smelled like stale coffee and a hint of cologne he always used too much of. The blinds were half open, letting in a dull wash of morning light. The place looked lived in shoes kicked near the couch jacket draped over a chairmail scattered on the counter. No signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, but something felt off anyway. Adrian stepped inside cautiously. Stay behind me. I scanned the living room, then the kitchen. Everything looked normal until I reached the small dining table. A stack of envelopes lay beside a notebook. The notebook was open to a page full of hastily scribbled words. I leaned closer. 3 lines stood out. I saw him again. He knows me. Call Lana. My stomach dropped. He was scared. Adrian picked up one of the envelopes. These are all addressed to your parents' house. Why would he have them? I whispered. He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled a small padded envelope from the bottom of the stack. It wasn't addressed to my parents. It was addressed to me. At Caleb's apartment. My breath caught. Open it. Adrian tore it carefully. Inside was a single USB drive and a printed note. The note read, "You didn't listen." So he followed me. He wanted answers. Now you're late. My pulse hammered in my ears. What does that mean? Adrian didn't speculate. He plugged the USB into his encrypted tablet. A folder popped open instantly. No password, no protection, just one video file. My heart climbed into my throat. Play it, I said. The video opened on a dimly lit street. The camera was shaky, as if recorded from a jacket pocket or a phone held low. A figure appeared, Caleb. He was standing near the beige rental house, looking around with confusion etched across his face. A voice, distorted and low, spoke from behind the camera. "You shouldn't be here." Caleb stepped back. "Who are you?" "You asked the wrong question," the voice replied, "and now your sister will have to clean up your mess." Caleb looked frightened now, genuinely frightened. "What do you want from her?" The camera moved closer. The silhouette of the person filming was tall, broad-shouldered, impossible to identify. "I want her to understand she's not untouchable." Caleb swallowed hard. "I didn't do anything." The camera cut abruptly, ending the video. The silence afterward felt suffocating. Adrian closed the file and looked at me with a steadiness I didn't feel. "He's alive." That video wasn't filmed to show harm. It was filmed to send a message. "What kind of message is that?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "The kind meant to push you exactly where they want you," he said. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. The room felt too small, too tight, too loud even in its quiet. "Where do they want me?" I finally asked. Adrian held my gaze. "Closer." I shook my head. "Closer to what?" "To the person orchestrating all of this," he said. "They're drawing you in and using Caleb as leverage." The truth hit with brutal clarity. What I was facing now had moved far beyond the boundaries of my research. The leak felt small compared to the force pushing in from every direction, and whatever was happening inside that rental house no longer looked like the heart of the problem. Something larger was pulling the strings, and I was standing directly in its path. Someone wanted me in the center of their web. And now they had my brother. Caleb didn't look up when I stepped into the living room of our childhood home, but I saw the way his shoulders stiffened. He'd been pacing for hours, judging by the half-finished mugs on the coffee table and the blinds he kept opening and closing. Dad sat on the sofa, the newspaper resting stiffly on his lap. Its pages increased, though his eyes hadn't moved from the same column since I walked in. The air felt thick, like everyone was waiting for someone else to take their first breath. "Where were you?" Caleb finally asked. Not accusatory this time, more like he hadn't slept and didn't know how to hide it. "Working," I answered, and that one word seemed to land right in the center of the room. His jaw tightened as if he wanted to say something sharp, but the edge didn't come. The Caleb I grew up with would have leapt at the opening, another chance to sneer at my non-career. Tonight he seemed unsure, almost wary. Dad folded the paper, rested it on his lap, and studied me with a seriousness I hadn't seen since before the layoffs, robbed him of his own confidence. "There were men outside earlier," he said quietly. "They weren't from the neighborhood. I'd seen them too. Dark sedan, windows tinted past legal, the sort of stillness that doesn't belong on a suburban street." "They're not here for you," I told him, even though that didn't seem to comfort him. Caleb rubbed the back of his neck. "Look, Lana, if you're in something dangerous, I'm not," I said, maybe too quickly. His eyes flashed in frustration, but beneath it was the same fear Dad was trying to hide. The silence stretched until Caleb broke it again. "I talked to someone, a guy I know from cyber forensics." His words came slow, like he had to decide whether to trust me with them. "He thinks whatever you're working on is bigger than any startup, any accelerator, any AI product out there right now." I waited. "He also said the breach wasn't random," he continued. "Whoever hit your servers knew exactly what they were looking for. They didn't steal anything else, didn't vandalize, didn't leave a trace of their own code." Dad frowned. "What does that mean?" Caleb hesitated. "It means they were professionals." My thoughts drifted back to the note slipped under my door, the blurred photograph of a man whose face I still couldn't fully place, the encrypted message forwarded to my private inbox before my system flagged it. I didn't tell them any of that. I didn't want to drag them deeper into something I still didn't understand. Dad cleared his throat. "Maybe it's time you told us what exactly you've been building." The question lingered between us. I could have given them the polished pitch deck version, the one with market slides and diplomatic language. Instead, I sat down across from them and spoke plainly. "I've been developing a model that can identify decision patterns in real-time financial, medical, geopolitical. It predicts the moment before a choice is made, not just the outcome after. Caleb's eyes widened. You mean, can it tell when someone's going to do something before they actually do it? In certain contexts, I said. Not perfectly, and not publicly. Dad leaned back, his breath slow and uneasy. Why would anyone hide something like that? Because people would fear it, I said softly, and because the wrong hands could weaponize it. Caleb walked to the window again, pushing the blinds open a sliver. So these people who've been circling you, they want the model. I don't know what they want, I said truthfully. But they're not casual hackers. He stared out into the yard, jaw tightening. You should have told us. That one stung, not because he was wrong, but because he was right. I'd always kept my work sealed off, partly out of habit, partly because every time I tried to share it, Caleb turned it into a joke, and Dad dismissed it as some passing phase. Tonight there was none of that. Just worry, they don't know how to express themselves. A car rolled by slowly. Caleb tracked it until the taillights disappeared. When he turned back to me, something in his expression had changed. It wasn't accepted, not yet, but the old derision was gone. What's your plan? He asked. I'm meeting someone tomorrow, I said. Someone who can help me trace where the breach originated and who's behind it. Dad stood. Then you're not going alone. I have to, I replied. If they think any of you are involved, they already think something, Caleb snapped. You saw the men outside. They know where we live. They know Dad's schedule. They probably know mine too. He exhaled sharply and lowered his voice. You can't shield us by walking into it alone. The way he said it, steady protective, felt like a version of Caleb I hadn't met in years. Dad stepped closer. We're family, he said quietly. Even when we're idiots. Even when we say things we shouldn't. You don't carry this alone. The words didn't erase years of judgment, but they softened something that had been rigid in me for too long. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, I didn't feel like I was standing at the edge of something terrifying with no one behind me. A sudden chime echoed from my phone, a notification, encrypted, different signature from the previous messages. Caleb noticed the shift in my expression. What is it? I opened the app. A single line appeared on the screen, time-stamped and untraceable. Do not trust the person you're meeting tomorrow. I read it twice before showing them. Dad's face was drained of color. Caleb stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. Lana, whoever sent that knows your schedule. The room felt colder somehow, not because of the house, not because of the shadows outside, because the threat had moved from abstract to immediate, and whoever was orchestrating this wasn't guessing they were watching. We need a new plan, Caleb said, steady now, as if something inside him had finally recalibrated, and this time, you're not going without backup. For the first time since the breach, I didn't argue. Morning light barely reached the porch when Caleb and I walked out, but the tension between us was bright as a warning flare. He didn't comment on the bag slung over my shoulder or the phone clutched in my hand. Dad hovered in the doorway, pretending not to watch, but gripping the frame like letting go meant losing us both. I'll text when I get there, I told him. He nodded without speaking. His eyes said everything: fear, frustration, pride, and something else that resembled apology. I didn't have time to unpack any of it. Caleb slid into the passenger seat without asking permission, the gesture blunt and familiar. If you're going, he said, I'm going. Arguing would have wasted time I didn't have. Fine. But you follow my lead. His smirk flickered. When do I not? I didn't bother answering. Our destination was a co-working loft on the edge of downtown, a space known for hosting founders, freelancers, and the occasional government contractor. The perfect place for someone who slipped between worlds, visible just enough to pass as normal, hidden enough to work on things no one talked about, out loud. I'd collaborated with him once years ago, when I was still unknown and naive. He'd helped me fix a recursive loop no one else could diagnose. We kept in sporadic touch. I never imagined the next time I saw him would be under circumstances like this. Traffic crawled along the viaduct. Caleb's foot bounced restlessly. Explain this guy again. Elias is a systems architect, I said. One of the best. What kind of systems? The kind you can't Google. He glanced at me, waiting. Predictive infrastructure, surveillance modeling, behavioral mapping. My voice stayed low. He works with anyone who pays, sometimes governments, sometimes private clients, sometimes people who don't list their names on anything official. Caleb let out a slow breath. So the anonymous warning could have been about him. Or from him, I said. Or from someone watching him. That's comforting. The loft came into view, brick building, wide windows, too quiet for a weekday. My chest tightened. Something about the stillness felt wrong. A man in a hoodie stood half a block away, pretending to check his phone, but his posture was too fixed. Another figure leaned against a bike rack without actually securing a bike. Caleb saw them too. "You're not going in there alone. We don't even know who they are. We don't have to. I'm still not letting you walk straight into it." Before I could respond, my phone buzzed. A new message from an unlisted contact. "You're early, 3rd floor, room 3B. Come alone." Caleb read over my shoulder. "Absolutely not. It might not be him," I said. "But if it is, he's expecting me." "Why alone?" "Because he doesn't trust you. He doesn't even know me. That's the problem." Caleb muttered something under his breath while scanning the street. "Fine. You go in. I'll stay outside. But if you're not out in 20 minutes, I'm coming up." 15, I countered. "Deal." The building's entrance loomed ahead, a keypad door with a smudged screen. My hands felt colder than the air when I typed the code Elias once gave me. The lock clicked open. A narrow hallway stretched toward an old elevator whose cables groaned like reluctant bones when I pressed the button. The ride to the 3rd floor felt endless. When the doors slid open, I stepped into a quiet corridor lined with glass offices. Only a few lights were on. Room 3B sat at the far end, its door half closed, a sliver of pale blue light spilling across the carpet. I knocked once. A voice called from inside. "Lana, come in." Elias's tone hadn't changed in years, smooth, analytical, always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. But something felt off, a subtle sharpness I didn't remember. He sat at a long table surrounded by monitors. Lines of code streamed across one screen. Network diagrams glowed on another. His dark hair was longer than before, and he looked thinner, stretched by too many nights without rest. "You got my message," he said, gesturing to the seat across from him. "That depends," I replied. "Did you send it?" His eyebrow lifted with mild amusement. "Which one?" "The warning." He leaned back. "No, but I'm aware of who did it." Unease crawled up my spine. "Who's someone interested in keeping you alive?" he said plainly. "Which is more than I can say for the people who broke into your system." My breath caught. "So, you know who did it. I know who ordered it." He pulled up a window on the nearest monitor. A company name appeared, an investment firm I recognized from the tech conferences Caleb mocked me for attending. Clean, reputable, the kind of entity that invests in AI for social good. "This makes no sense," I whispered. "Why would they come after me?" Elias clicked again. A profile opened. A headshot appeared. A woman. Sharp eyes. A quiet smile. Familiar in a way that scraped at memory. "You worked with her 3 years ago," Elias said. "She pitched you on joining her research initiative. You declined. A few months later, she founded a private think tank with extremely aggressive acquisition strategies. I barely knew her. And yet she knew exactly what you were building," he said. "She's been monitoring you since the day you turned her down." My mouth went dry. "Monitoring how? Through people you trust. Through people who trust them. Through proximity." His gaze fixed on mine. "There's a reason her new facility is 4 doors from your parents' home." The air in the room felt suddenly thin. "You're saying she targeted my family?" "I'm saying she needed leverage," Elias said. "You're more likely to comply when the threat feels personal." I couldn't speak. The photograph of the facility, the men watching the street, the breach, the warning. Everything snapped into a single line. Elias leaned forward. "You have one advantage she doesn't expect." "What advantage?" His eyes darkened with something like urgency. "You're not alone anymore." Before I could ask what that meant, a shadow moved past the frosted office glass. Then another. Elias's voice dropped to a whisper. "They're here for you, not for me." My heartbeat hammered against my ribs. Caleb was downstairs. Dad was at home. Whoever wanted my model had decided waiting wasn't necessary anymore. Elias shut off the monitors in one swift motion and grabbed a small encrypted drive from the desk. "You need to leave, now." "What about you?" I asked. "They won't risk touching me," he said. "I'm valuable. You're urgent." The footsteps in the hallway grew louder. Elias pressed the drive into my palm. "This contains everything you need to finish your work safely." "Why help me?" I whispered. A faint smile touched his lips. "Because you were right to turn her down, and because someone finally needs to win a war she's been fighting with shadows for too long." The door handle behind me began to turn. Elias pushed me toward the back exit. "Go." And I ran. The ballroom disappeared the moment the car door closed behind me. Inside the quiet cabin, the chaos I'd just walked through felt distant, softened by the steady hum of the engine and the glow of city lights drifting across the glass. My pulse finally found a slower rhythm. I let myself lean back, breathing in the warmth that filled the space, warmth that didn't demand anything from me. Adrian merged into traffic without speaking, giving me room to settle. The ceremony still echoed faintly in my mind, the applause, the cameras tilting toward me, the sudden eruption of breaking news banners spilling across the screens. For hours I'd been surrounded by faces, questions, lights. Now, with only the road ahead and the dark folding around us, I felt something in my chest loosen that had been tied up for far too long. I turned toward the window. The city slid by in long, shimmering streaks. Street lamps stretched into gold lines, neon signs pulsing softly against wet pavement, the river catching whatever light it could. A dog walker moved along the waterfront. A lone jogger crossed the footbridge. Their lives weren't touched by the storms I'd survived, yet watching them left me strangely grounded. Caleb and Dad were still inside, somewhere between disbelief and quiet pride. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to convince them of anything. They'd seen enough. They'd seen me. That alone felt like a chapter turning. Adrian glanced over once as if checking whether I was still breathing in the calm. "You handled tonight," he said softly. "It didn't feel real," I admitted. "Any of it." It was. The truth settled in slowly, like warmth spreading through my hands. I rested the award on my lap, letting its weight anchor me. Just hours earlier, this whole night had terrified me, standing on that stage, facing the world with everything exposed, knowing the people who once doubted me were sitting in the same room. But the moment I stepped into the light, something inside me shifted. Not because of the recognition, but because I finally felt present in my own work. I used to think fear was a sign I wasn't ready. I said watching the city blur by. Now I'm not so sure. "Fear means you're doing something that matters," Adrian replied. "That's all." The words fit into place with ease, like they'd belonged somewhere inside me for years, but hadn't found their way until now. The car turned onto the bridge, and the river came into view, dark, wide, carrying the reflection of the skyline like a slow-moving constellation. I kept watching it, letting the calm settle deeper. "I've been fighting to prove myself for so long," I said quietly. "To my family, to the industry, to anyone who thought I couldn't build something real, even to myself. I don't feel that anymore." "What do you feel?" "Ready," I said, "for whatever happens next." He nodded, not needing anything more. In the seat beside me, the encrypted drive Elias had pressed into my hand felt heavier now that the adrenaline had worn off. Inside it lived the future of Meridian, the parts I'd built, the parts I'd lost, and the parts he'd protected at the cost of his own safety. The woman who tried to steal my work was now in custody. The facility near my parents' house was being dismantled. But my story wasn't ending with an arrest or an award. The road ahead glowed beneath the headlights, curving gently into the distance. It felt symbolic in a way I didn't question. Sometimes life hands you metaphors without asking permission. "I'm rebuilding it," I said. "Meridian, all of it. But this time with intention, with safeguards, and with the right people in the room." "Good," Adrian murmured. "It deserves that." "So do I added. The car glided past a line of streetlights, each one casting a brief halo across the windshield. The rhythm of it was soothing. Light, dark light again. Almost like a reminder that the worst parts of the past few months were behind me, now absorbed into something larger and steadier. For the first time in a long time, I felt aligned with my own life. Not running, not defending. Just stepping toward the next chapter with a clarity I didn't know I was capable of. I turned back to the road ahead, letting the moment settle fully. Do you ever think I asked softly that the hardest things we go through end up becoming the things that give us a direction we didn't know we needed? Adrian smiled faintly. Every day. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was full of possibility of breath, of something like hope. And if you're still with me, if you followed this story from the moment my own family laughed at my career to the moment I stood on that stage tonight, then maybe you're carrying your own battle scars too. Maybe you know what it feels like to be underestimated, dismissed, pushed aside. I hope my story reminds you of something simple and true. You get to choose the next chapter. And if you want to hear what came after the launch, the fallout. The unexpected alliances that shaped everything that followed, stay close. Leave a comment. Share your thoughts, because the quiet after the storm isn't the end, it's the beginning.